After publishing lyrical ballads with his friend Coleridge, Wordsworth, along with his sister Dorothy and Coleridge, went to Germany. Coleridge wanted to go there to learn the language in hopes of doing some translations of German philosophers. Spent a lot of time at the University of Göttingen. The Wordsworths, however, ended up living in this small village called Goslar, small German village called Goslar. They didn't know anyone, they didn't speak the language. So basically, they spent a very brutal winter, the winter of 1799, in Goslar, really falling back almost entirely on each other for support and also reaching back in memory to their beloved Lake District. And it was here in 1799 in Goslar that Wordsworth began the work that later became known as the Prelude. He started piecing together how his childhood experiences in the Lake District shaped him into the poet that he had become by that time. So he completed a brief version of the Prelude in around 1799. And then by 1805, he expanded the work to 13 books. But he did not publish it at that time. One reason is that he felt self conscious about writing a whole poem just about himself that had never been done before. So he worried that the audience would not react. He also just didn't simply feel comfortable with his own authority. So essentially, then he revised the poem for the next 45 years. And in 1850, when he died, it was finally published in 14 books, and it was called The Prelude. Why? Wordsworth had set out in the late 18th century to write a grand philosophical poem that would study man, nature, and their relationship. Coleridge had recommended that he do this. Well, he found a difficult time completing this ambitious work. He called it The Recluse. And throughout his life, really only finished about three parts of The Recluse, one part of which is really quite wonderful. So he imagined, well, if I'm not really finishing The Recluse, maybe I'll do something in the meantime. Maybe I'll write a prelude to The Recluse. Maybe I'll sort of warm up by writing my own history before I can start thinking about man in general and nature in general. So this is why the Prelude got its name. It was titled that after Wordsworth died. Wordsworth, throughout his life, called it the poem to Coleridge, because indeed he wrote it to Coleridge. That's the friend throughout the piece, Coleridge. But it was called by Wordsworth's family after he passed on, the Prelude, or the growth of a poet's mind. So we have the 1805 Prelude, and that's what I want to talk about today. So right now I want to talk about three models behind the Prelude that influence the Prelude and how the Prelude inflects these particular models. So the first model we could call the Confession. The prime example of this would be St. Augustine's Confessions, in which he essentially tries to work out his salvation in very raw confessions to God. But in the course of that work, Augustine is essentially trying to turn himself into a Christian everyman. Certainly, there are very particular instances of his life that he describes transgressions, sadnesses, victories. But ultimately, he wants to see these particular events within the general framework of the Christian story of salvation and redemption. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau also wrote confessions, but his were, in contrast to Augustine's, very personal, just for the sake of being personal. Rousseau was not trying, in other words, to connect his story to some kind of general narrative. So Wordsworth in the Prelude is coming in right between these two, Augustine and Rousseau. His work is a confession. He's confessing his feelings about his life in the present. He's confessing his feelings about his life in childhood. But he's not trying to fit his confessions into a biblical structure. Ultimately, he's trying to discover what structures are in play in his psychological profile, let's call it. So in this regard, he's not like Rousseau either. He's not into vulnerable, raw confessions just for the sake of confession. He focuses on events in his life that have fed into his life as a poet. So even though he is being personal, he also is aspiring to the general. This is what a poet should be. And even though he does rise to the general in imagining what a poet should be, he never leaves behind the particular. He still stays close to his childhood in the Lake District. So what I'm saying is that in some ways the Prelude is a combination of the more general confession of the Confessions of Augustine and the more particular confessions of Rousseau. So that's one model, what I'm calling the confession. Another model for the poem is called the Bildungsroman, which is a German term for a narrative of formation, usually a novel about how a young person grows into adulthood, a coming of age novel, we might call it. Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship would be a prime example of this, where we see Wilhelm Meister grow from a child to an adult, and we learn about what event shaped him into the kind of person he became. Sometimes the Bildungsroman takes the form of a Kunstelroman, or the formation of an artist. James Joyce is quite overt about this in his Portrait of the Artist as a young man. What factors affected Stephen Dedalus and turned him into an artist? So certainly, as I said in my discussion just a minute ago about the poem as confession, Wordsworth is really interested in his development from a small boy to an adult, what factors affected his development, but ultimately he's interested in what turned him into the poet that he is today, and what will he need to sustain him as a poet. A third influence is a little more complicated, and that's what I want to spend the rest of this lecture discussing. Both of these models, the confession and the Bildungsroman, are personal in varying degrees. But Wordsworth also wanted this poem, this autobiographical poem, in a strange way to be an epic. Now, when we think of an epic, we think, of course, of a narrative in which a particular hero manifests the virtues of the culture from which he arose. We think of Homer's Odyssey, we think of Virgil's Aeneid, we think of Dante's Divine Comedy, we think of Milton's Paradise Lost. These are not personal stories. These are stories that are meant to talk about general virtues that should ideally inform culture. So how is Wordsworth thinking about his work as an epic? Well, let's look at the very beginning of the poem. He opens up the 1805 by saying, "Oh, there is a blessing in this gentle breeze that blows from the green fields and from the clouds and from the sky. It beats against my cheek and seems half conscious of the joy it gives." He's simply invoking the wind. But we have to remember that wind is also spirit. The Latin word spiritus means spirit, but also it means wind. So Wordsworth is invoking a secularized version of spirit. In a way, he is invoking the wind as a kind of muse. We might remember that Milton in Paradise Lost invokes the same muse that inspired Moses to write the first 5 books of the Bible. In Milton's time, it was thought that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Urania, that's the muse. And we think of Homer and Virgil both invoking the actual muses of Greek or Roman mythology. Well, here Wordsworth is, in his humble, everyday way, invoking the muse. Wind, give me energy. Wind, give me life. Maybe the wind has a kind of consciousness itself, but he contextualizes the wind in a secular, ordinary context. So this gives us a hint that Wordsworth's trying to write a very personal epic. He's trying to redefine the epic, basically saying that the epic need not be some grand mythopoetic narrative, that the epic can be an everyday story about an everyday person connecting with the natural world. Now, there are other hints in these opening lines that suggest Wordsworth's epic desire. He says, "Oh, welcome messenger, welcome friend." This is what the wind is. A captive greets thee, coming from a house of bondage, and from yon city's walls set free, a prison where he hath been long immured. Now I am free, enfranchised and at large, may fix my habitation where I will. What dwelling shall receive me? In what vale shall be my harbor? Underneath what grove shall I take up my home? And what sweet stream shall with its murmurs lull me to my rest? The earth is all before me. With a heart joyous nor scared at its own liberty, I look about, and should the guide I choose be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. Now, I discussed in class the other day that if you look at the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, Moses leads the Israelites throughout the desert for 40 years. He is led by a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. So here Wordsworth saying, there's a wandering cloud that might lead me about. And earlier he says that I'm coming from a house of bondage. Moses leads the Israelites from Egypt, called a house of bondage. So here Wordsworth is likening himself through these allusions to Moses, basically saying, I'm like this character from the Bible who leads the Israelites on this epic journey from bondage to freedom. But of course, Wordsworth's not doing that. What he's doing, he's thinking about his own personal freedom, his own particular way of moving from the bondage of an actual city, London, and finding freedom in the natural world. So he's taking the Moses character and secularizing the Moses character, psychologizing, we might say, the Moses character. Freedom and bondage for Wordsworth are less about religion and culture and more about his own psychology, his own personality, the Moses within. Now, you probably heard me as I was reading this nod toward another important mythic allusion, and that is when he says the earth was all before me. Well, of course, this is the end of Paradise Lost, where Milton says of Adam and Eve, the earth was all before them. So not only is Wordsworth likening himself to Moses, he's also likening himself to Adam, in particular Milton's Adam. But he's not going to be the Adam of the Judeo-Christian story. He's not going to be the Adam of the fall and potential redemption. He's the Adam who is trying to move in a meaningful way through a fallen world, not guided so much by God, but guided by his own imagination. And it's interesting that Wordsworth here appropriates Milton's Adam as if to say, I'm going to be the true Adam, John Milton. Your Adam was not the true Adam, so I'm a better poet than you in a way. So this kind of epic desire Wordsworth has is a desire for a personal epic, an epic that is less about external events and grand cultural movements, and an epic that is more about the psyche, the inner workings of the mind, and how one's interior life can ultimately determine whether one will be in bondage or free, whether one will be constrained or open. So these are the three models, or three of the most important models that are informing the poem: the Confession, the Bildungsroman, and the Epic.